It's time to learn from the best at game devs. Tony Chan here, and welcome to episode 92 of Game Dev Loadout, where I chat with inspiring professionals every Wednesday morning to bring you the motivation and tactics for a successful gaming career. Now let's chat with today's featured guest, Chris Remo. Chris, it is game time. Are you ready?
Yep.
Let's do this. He is the designer and composer over at Campo Santo, which created the highly praised game Firewatch. He also co-hosts a ton of podcasts, including Important Cast, Idle Thumbers, Idle Book Club, Peaks Rewatch. Am I missing anything else there?
I think that's all the current ones.
Awesome. So go ahead and give us a bit about your personal life, Chris, and how you got started in the game industry.
I got involved in the game industry in a sort of a strange and unintentional way. I was a music major in college, and I figured I was going to be in a rock band for my job. That's the kind of I'd sort of figured, oh yeah, that's just what I'll do. Not really realizing that that's not really something you can guarantee will happen. And I ended up completely unrelatedly co-founding a video game website with some friends called Idle Thumbs, which we launched in 2004, and as sort of just a hobby project of ours. And that ended up leading to me getting a job as a full-time video game journalist a couple years later. And from that point on, I ended up working as a journalist for several years before I was recruited by Irrational Games, the developer of BioShock, several games of the BioShock series, and worked on BioShock Infinite for a couple years before I went over to Double Fine Productions, the developer of Psychonauts, Brutal Legend, and other games where I did a bunch of different things, including writing. I was a co-writer on The Cave, with Ron Gilbert, and did the soundtrack for Space Base DF9 and contributed in various capacities to a bunch of different things at Double Fine. And then I ended up at Campo Santo when we were starting up the studio to make Firewatch. And on that game, I was a game designer, and I was on the story team, as well as being the audio director and making the music soundtrack for the game as well. And then over the years, I've just done I've done composition and writing for other games on kind of a sort of freelance basis. So I did the soundtrack for Gone Home by Fulbright, and for 30 Flights of Loving by Blendo Games. And recently I co-wrote the Star Wars VR game, the X-Wing VR mission, for Battlefront 2, or Battlefront, I guess. So, yeah. I just do a bunch of different things.
First off, how in the world are you so good at all these different skills?
Yeah. I don't know that I am necessarily that amazing, but I think the thing that has really defined my career, which is really different, I think, to some people in the games industry, is that I'm not really a specialist at anything. I am very much a generalist, so I do a lot of different things. So currently primarily game design, but also writing music. I do a lot of web development as well. And I think the thing that has really helped me out is my willingness to learn things on the job. So I've almost never been hired to do the job that I ended up doing, but I've always been interested in, when I get somewhere, trying to learn more than the specific thing I was hired for. And I've found that when you can become useful for things, people don't necessarily care whether or not you got a degree in it, or, whether you're officially trained to do the thing or not. But if you're willing to learn stuff and increase your skill set and your general knowledge, that can go a long way. I mean, that's really the only reason I have any kind of career, because I'm not, I'm certainly not an engineer by training. I'm not any sort of incredible specialist at anything, but I think my main skill is my ability to sort of understand how different pieces fit together and try and learn more skills, hit the ground running and pick things up as I go.
It's funny how you say that you're never technically doing the job that you're hired to do and you end up doing something else. And I guess that kind of brings up a point. Like, is it advised or recommended for other game devs to learn about the other jobs at the workplace? Like, should a programmer learn what an artist do? Of course, I believe that they should, but like, is it recommended for them to take the time to learn other people's job over there?
I think so. I think it's really useful to be able to talk to people in different disciplines and understand where they're coming from, because every different person in every different discipline has different assumptions that they bring to any given problem. And I think sometimes it can be frustrating. Like if you're a designer and a programmer, you're talking to a programmer and a programmer has a particular idea of how things work, and you as the designer have a particular idea of how things work. Sometimes it can feel like the other person just doesn't understand, but it's usually not that they don't understand. It's usually that they just have a different basis of understanding and a different set of assumptions that come from their discipline. And there are probably a whole bunch of things they understand about the problem that maybe didn't occur to you, and vice versa. And so I think it can be really useful to understand, to try and understand as many different parts of the game as you can, especially if you're, I think, a designer, because really everything on the game is part of game design. I mean, there isn't really anything that doesn't relate to game design. Like if a certain art asset isn't clear enough, that can affect the game design because the player isn't, maybe doesn't take from it the meaning that they're supposed to, and that affects how they interact with the thing. So, I mean, pretty much everything is important, I think, to a game designer. The other thing, though, I'd say about that is, while it is, and this is also something I can say from experience, while I think it is really valuable to learn as much as you can and try to contribute as much as you can, it's also important not to get ahead of yourself and not to assume that you are more important than you are. I mean, I definitely earlier in my career, I think there were times where I got too excited about learning other things beyond my, specific job and pitching in. And that can be annoying, if you're doing it in a way where you're kind of like stepping on other people's toes or getting too much ahead of yourself unnecessarily. So, you have to sort of balance being ready to learn and sort of eager to broaden your skill set. You have to balance that with not getting in people's way and not being too, overeager. So it's a tough balancing act. You have to keep both sides in mind.
I guess don't annoy people with all these questions all the time, or just. I mean,
just know to read people, right? One of the things I've found is that a lot of people some people don't like being asked questions, but some people really do. I mean, I've definitely worked with a lot of programmers who love when non-programmers ask them questions. I mean, I'm not a trained engineer, but at this point I can write enough code to be dangerous, and I can, figure out my way around, certainly the whole project. And some programmers really love helping people out. I mean, some programmers get really excited when a non-programmer member of the team is interested in being able to write more code themselves or contributing to the project in other ways. And, some people are just less interested in that. So I think knowing who you're talking to and how receptive they are to that is certainly valuable.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about your writing and your podcast. So should every company make a podcast or at least a blog about their game?
I think it's good to have some form of communication outwardly to your community. It doesn't have to be a podcast specifically. It doesn't have to be a blog. It could be either one. It could be something. It could be a newsletter, an email newsletter. It could be something else. But I do think it's important, especially if you're a smaller company. I mean, if you work for a huge company like EA or something, I mean, they have massive marketing departments with, tens of millions of dollars spent per game sometimes, and they have all kinds of ways to get the message out. But if you're at a smaller studio, or if you're a independent developer, I think it's really, really important to develop some kind of ongoing connection to the community, because I think that's the most powerful means you have for people to develop a relationship to you and hopefully your future games, if you're lucky enough to keep making them, and to spread the word and to get people interested in what you're doing. And it's also, I think, just kind of a good thing for game development generally, for more people to understand what goes into making games. I think traditionally video games have been very bad at communicating how they're made and what goes into making them compared to something like film. There are so many documentaries and behind the scenes featurettes, and there's so many books and so many different ways to learn about how films are made. And that is, I think, definitely been changing in recent years in video games. But traditionally that information has been really obscure, compared to how it is in a lot of other creative fields. And so I think it is beneficial both to studios and also to the whole kind of world of games broadly, for the people who make games to try and share what they're doing to some degree. I mean, obviously it's always hard to find the time to put out extra information because everyone just wants to put their head down and make the game because there's never even enough time to get that done. But I do think it pays off.
Yeah, and that's what I want to talk about. Like, what are your key principles for making sure we communicate really well with the audience, that we like posting the right things or writing the right things? Like, what do you suggest with how we get started in communicating our game to the public?
I actually look at communication with pretty much the same way I look at game design. I think they're very similar. I think, to me, the most important skill or practice in game design is to think about what the person on the other end of the design is going to think. I mean, you can never predict that perfectly, but it's really easy when you're the person making something to say, oh, well, this obviously makes sense. This design makes sense, or this sort of UI element makes sense, or this system makes sense, because you have all the information about it in your head, and either you came up with it in the first place or someone on your team did, and you're so familiar with all the elements of it that of course it makes sense to you. The thing that's difficult is then put yourself in the position of someone who doesn't know anything about your game, doesn't know how anything works, and try to imagine, okay, if I had absolutely no preconceived notions or knowledge about this particular thing, how would it come off to me? And that's the same way that I think about communication, because especially on the internet, when there's so much information available all the time from every angle, and there's essentially infinite information that anyone could be looking at all the time, you should never, ever, ever assume that anyone has already seen your information, because they probably haven't. I've seen this so many times where game developers will announce some, I don't know, like a change to something, a change to a release date, or like some change to a feature, or just something, and then they'll see people respond to it and be like, oh, I didn't even know the previous version of this. And they're like, well, we announced it 2 months ago. How did you not see that? It's like, no one has seen anything. Like, don't ever assume anyone has seen any of your stuff. You have to always like give enough information that someone who's linked to it for the first time, or stumbles upon it, or is confused about what it is, will understand it clearly. Or, I mean, that doesn't mean that literally every time you say anything, you have to explain everything from square one. Obviously, that would be kind of annoying if you know, it's like, but know the audience that you're talking to, and don't assume they have some special knowledge that they could only have if they've been following every single thing you've ever said. You know, like, it's because very few people are going to do that. There's so much stuff out there on the internet that you just can't assume that someone's going to come to any message you put out with all of the knowledge that you wish they would have.
Now, that's one problem that I'm coming across is reposting. Like, how do we repost without feeling like it's a spam, or that's part I'm having right now. Like, because, you know, like you said, they might miss the news that you put out there on social media or something, or they just might overlook it or something. So, how would we go about reposting something so, you know, everybody get their eyes on it?
I don't really think it's that big of a deal. I mean, I think if you reposting something, you know, every few days or once a week or something, I really just don't think it's anyone minds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, if you follow, I don't know, a magazine like the New Yorker magazine or something on Twitter. I just bring that up as an example because I noticed that they do this frequently. They'll post the same article like every week. Like they'll literally post the exact a tweet about one article a whole bunch of times. And I'll notice that sometimes. I'll be like, oh, right, I read that article because they tweeted about that 2 weeks ago. But I don't really mind as long as they're not being obnoxious about it and doing it like multiple times a day and kind of just going crazy. One thing I've noticed they do is they post different. They'll write a new message each time they post it, even though they might link to the same thing. They bother to write different text to accompany it each time. We certainly do that with our podcast, for instance, not all the time, but sometimes if we put an episode out on Friday, we'll tweet about it on Friday, but then, next Tuesday, we'll tweet about the same episode again, but write a new tweet. Even if we're linking to the same place, we'll write a new line of text linking to the same episode because almost certainly most of the people who follow the account didn't see it the first time. That's a thing that is really surprising, but true about social media or really anything on the internet. Let's say you have X many followers. Let's say, you have, 5,000 followers, whatever, 10,000. It doesn't matter how many, 100,000. It makes no difference. You might think when you put out that tweet, oh, this many people are going to see it. No, they definitely won't. It'll be a tiny minority of that number of people who actually see it, because the only people who are going to see it are the ones who just happened to be online that time when you posted it, or maybe a few more who get caught by the sort of algorithms on Twitter and Facebook that try and, give the content to people who might like it. But you definitely cannot assume that most of the people who follow that account saw it. So there's really nothing, you really have no choice but to just put the message back out there again later. But hopefully you do it in a way that is slightly different and not literally a copy paste, so that the people who did see it the first time don't feel like they're just getting spammed.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm definitely going to try out that now. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
Awesome. So let's take this on a more personal level. And you've been in the game industry working on all types of game. What was the worst moment of your career? That one moment that's still vivid in your mind. Be very detailed and tell us that personal story.
Oh, man. Oof, that's a tough question. I don't know if I could like necessarily identify the worst, but definitely when I moved, I don't know if worst is the right word for this, but I would say challenging. I remember when my first job in game development was at Irrational Games. It wasn't technically the first. I had done testing on Psychonauts before that, and I had done a soundtrack as a contractor before that. But my first time actually working full time at a video game studio was when I moved to Irrational Games. And I had lived in San Francisco for my whole adult life. And Irrational was out in Boston. And I kind of just took that job sight unseen, and I didn't even like know the city at all. Maybe I'd been there like once briefly or something. I didn't really know anything about Boston. And I moved there, and I was kind of just living in this temporary apartment, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And then this like winter came, and it was this like historically terrible Boston winter. Like I remember all the news reports were saying this is like the worst winter in years and years and years. And it was super cold, and I had been, coming from California. And it was, and I didn't really know anybody, I didn't have any friends out there really, cause I just wasn't from there. And I didn't, like I said, I was new to the job. So it's just this very kind of alienating experience. And it wasn't really anyone's fault. It was just really difficult. It was just very challenging. And I ended up actually meeting someone, a friend of mine. She's Australian actually. And she had moved to Boston with her, now the person who's now her husband. And she, by total coincidence, ended up also getting a job at Irrational several months later. And she ended up becoming my best friend in that area while I lived there. And we've been friends now for like almost a decade. and she now works for the same studio that I work for out here in San Francisco. So it's like out of this really challenging initial experience, I ended up meeting someone who I stayed very good friends with for a very long time. And now I work with again every day. And that's actually something that I guess is sort of related to advice. This is sort of going off your question, but probably if I had to give advice to people who were trying to develop a career or start one or sort of grow one, I would say maintain the friendships and connections that you make in the industry or just not even necessarily in the industry, but with people who you respect creatively or professionally, even if you don't directly work with them, because literally pretty much every single opportunity I've had in the video game industry has been the result of some friendship or collaboration that happened, years ago in the past, or someone I met years ago. Jake Rodkin, who co-founded Campo Santo, the studio where we made Firewatch, he was one of the co-founders of the website we started back in 2004. And then, 10 years later, we ended up making Firewatch together, so, and we never worked together. We never actually worked together as full time until then. We did the Idle Thumbs podcast together for almost, for years and years. But we never actually had a full-time job where we worked on the same thing, but we stayed friends and collaborators on kind of part-time projects for all those years until it led to this actual professional relationship. So that has been so valuable to me. I mean, that has been more valuable to me than anything else in my career has been cultivating those really long-term friendships and collaborations. And it's not like I was doing that because I was like, I bet that years down the line, this will result in some kind of job or opportunity. Like it wasn't intentional in that regard. But when I look back, I can recognize, oh, wow, yeah, there's so many people that I became friends with just because we kind of liked each other and liked each other's sensibilities. And eventually it led to actual real opportunities. I mean, Steve Gaynor, who was the writer and designer of Gone Home, one of the games for which I did the soundtrack, I know him because he applied to be a writer for that website that Jake and I founded with a bunch of other people back in 2004. I still have the email he sent in, I think, 2005, actually, where he said, hey, I really like your website. I want to write for you guys. And then I ended up recommending him to work at Irrational Games when I moved there, which he did after having worked on some other games previously. After we both left Irrational, he started Fulbright, made Gone Home, and asked if I wanted to do the music for it. And again, that was something that was years after we met just as kind of friends on the internet, but it ended up resulting in these really cool collaborations. So, yeah, even out of challenging experiences, meeting people who went on to become good friends and collaborators was, kind of the silver lining.
Yeah, it's cool how long you've been working with these guys, how long you've known them, and then eventually work with them. And does your friend in the beginning of the story, does she know about the story?
Oh yeah, because I met her actually like 2 weeks after I moved to Boston, and we were introduced by a mutual friend at just like some kind of get together at a bar or something. I don't really remember what we talked about or anything like that, but yeah, I mean, we definitely just became good friends, and I'm sure she's highly aware of how. I mean, I'm sure she could relate to the situation because she also had just moved to the United States from Australia a few months before, so she was also probably, or maybe not a few months before. Yeah, actually, maybe only a few months before that. Yeah, so I think she also was, definitely sort of disoriented and in a new place and so on. So I think we probably related on that level.
How old were you when you make that big move?
I was in my mid-20s. I was probably like 25 or 26.
Well, what made you make that big jump? Like, you said that you was just thinking, or you just made it, or there was something that kind of pushed you towards that?
Well, because I really respected the developer. I mean, I thought Irrational Games. I mean, they don't really exist anymore in the same form, but that was a really great studio. I mean, they made BioShock, they made System Shock 2, SWAT 4. I mean, that studio was responsible for some games that I thought were really, really great. System Shock 2 and BioShock in particular, I thought were just absolutely incredible games. And I had actually written a design article on System Shock 2, I don't know, maybe 6 months before I got that job offer. And I don't actually know if it was related, but I kind of suspect that writing that article was related to why I ended up getting that job offer. Because I had replayed it for the first time in years and just was really struck by how many interesting decisions were made on the design side in that game. And I was working for Gama Sutra, which is a site for game developers, a site about game design and game development, and I think it's called the art and business of making games, I think is the slogan. And I'd been there for a couple of years, and so I'd just been thinking a lot about game development and interacting with a lot of game developers. And, when the opportunity came to work for a studio like Irrational Games, it was pretty hard to turn down. I mean, I'm glad I did it. I don't regret it. I don't mean to suggest that it was like a bad idea. But it was definitely quite an adjustment.
Definitely. So let's move on to the next point. What are bad recommendations do you hear in your profession? Something that we game devs should definitely avoid.
Oh, I would say something that to avoid this is something that really bothers me personally, is the kind of drinking the Kool-Aid thing. I feel like, and I understand why this happens, but I feel like a lot of game developers kind of fall into this mentality of like, I don't know how to put it, but there's this sort of attitude sometimes that happens where
we just go with the flow. Well,
it's more that this is a really dangerous area, I guess. But a thing that happens is a kind of us versus them mentality that sometimes happens between people playing the game and people making the game. And when you go online, it can be really demoralizing and shitty because people complain about things a lot and don't understand, a lot of the sort of, like I was sort of saying earlier, a lot of the messaging you put out, and people it can be really difficult to deal with. But I think one of the things that a game developers, a skill that you have to have as a game developer is understanding the difference between legitimate criticism and just kind of abuse and complaining, and not confusing the two things. Like, because there is a lot of abuse and complaining on the internet, which is bad, I think a lot of developers can sometimes end up thinking that all criticism or feedback is actually just complaining. You know what I mean? Whereas I think it's actually a really valuable skill to be able to identify when things you've done maybe didn't work for people, and understand how to learn from that and get better, and not fall into the trap of just assuming that any negative reactions or criticism is just worthless and is just people whining. There really always is something to learn from what you could have done better, and to learn from, design decisions or other development decisions you made. And even sometimes, even when people are being, I think, not very constructive in their criticism, sometimes even then there's stuff to learn. I mean, obviously I don't want to suggest that if people are actually being abusive or hateful, you should give them any credit. I mean, the internet makes it easier for people to just be abusive without providing any valuable feedback whatsoever, and that's not appropriate. But usually when someone just doesn't like something, there's a reason, and it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that they're right per se, but there might be something that you can learn from the way they react to things. I mean, it's the same reason playtesting is important. It's the same reason it's good to get naive feedback and playtesting, because you might think you have everything figured out, and you might think that, the design is excellent, or, the game works really well, but it doesn't really mean anything if at the end of the day it doesn't work for people when they play it.
Yeah. just do not feed the trolls. Like you mentioned, do not fuel.
Yeah, definitely not.
Because I seen some game devs go that down that rabbit hole. It is not good. So yeah, don't feed the trolls, but definitely, take in the constructive criticism for sure.
Yeah, and don't feed the trolls is a good thing to add to that, because the other danger is getting in arguments that you can't win.
Exactly.
Where it's like, if you get sucked into stuff on the internet, you've basically already lost. I mean, there's very little you can do. You'll just make yourself more mad, and you probably won't do anything to the other person. I mean, I think it is good to stand up for your principles. Like it is definitely good. It doesn't mean just like be silent and don't, you should stand up for things that you think are important or messages that you want to send. But getting in an actual just like fight with some anonymous person on the internet is never very rarely useful.
Yeah, don't do that, game devs. Don't do that. Awesome. What do you consider one of the best investments you've ever made? It could be investment of money, time, or energy. What was that great investment?
That's a really good question. I think probably if I had to kind of go all the way back to the total arc of my career, if you want to call it that, probably the time and effort involved in starting the Idle Thumbs podcast with Jake Rodkin and Nick Brecken, who I still co-host it with to this day. Because doing that as a free time project means that all of us, that podcast has survived across all of us having several different jobs each. And it's been a really nice, constant thing sort of in the background of our careers. And I think it has really helped increase. I mean, I can certainly speak for myself. I mean, I think it's increased my profile in the industry. And it's also really helped me understand games and game design in a way that I wasn't intentional when we started doing it, but being forced to publicly put together a bunch of interesting opinions about games, for hundreds of episodes at this point. I think we're episode 330 something at this point, has really sort of trained my brain to think through games, particularly the design side of games, in an analytical and fairly cogent way that I think has helped me in a lot of different parts of my career. I don't think I would have expected that to be my answer, but I think it probably is.
So you're saying the podcast that you created, because you were talking about games, I guess every weekly, it actually made you a better game developer.
I think it definitely made me a better game developer. Yeah, for sure.
Ooh, yeah, I might have to start something like that too now. What's the game industry booming now? Like, what are you most excited about today?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the things I'm most excited about is how many different ways people are. I mean, this is very specific to what we do at Campo Santo. But one of the things that we really tried to do in Firewatch was have a video game that was very story and narrative driven, that had player agency and player interactivity be very important in the game, but not through combat mechanics or puzzle mechanics or sort of traditional challenge-based mechanics. And not that there's anything wrong with any of those things. I mean, I play a lot of different kinds of games, including games with all of those things in them. But we were really interested in telling a story where the story itself was the primary mechanic, as opposed to being something that was on top of or next to like a combat mechanic or a puzzle mechanic or something like that. And I would say even like 5 years ago, there weren't that many games that did that, but now there are actually an increasing number all the time. And I think that's really cool and really exciting. I mean, there's a million different trends that I think are cool in what's been happening in games recently, but that's one that is really directly relevant to what we're trying to do. And so I think it's really encouraging to see.
What about your next project? Is it following the same path as Firewatch?
It's going to be different than Firewatch in a lot of ways. But our next game, In the Valley of Gods, it does share that in common, which is that it is a heavily story and character driven game, but without combat mechanics or traditional kind of puzzle mechanics or things like that. I mean, I think it's going to play a lot differently than Firewatch, and it's certainly the setting is a lot different and the characters are different. A lot of things are different about it, but we're still trying to approach it from that same attitude of telling a really compelling story with compelling characters in a compelling location, where there's still a lot of player interactivity and you're still doing a lot of things and driving the experience, but without kind of traditional combat or failure-based states.
Gotcha. Well, what is that one game that influenced you the most and why?
Oh, man. God, picking one is so difficult.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, man. I mean, I have to say, before I say this, I don't actually think I can give you only one example. I think that's impossible. But since I was specifically talking about story games, I'll say Full Throttle is a game that I think is certainly not the best game or anything, but it is maybe the best written game that I can think of. That was Tim Schafer's 1995 adventure, sort of biker adventure game. And it's just the characters in that game are just incredible. And I think maybe unmatched by any other game I can think of. I mean, that is a traditional adventure game, so there are a lot of puzzles in it. So it's really different than what we're trying to do. But when I just think about how powerful the characters and writing are in that game, it just still totally blows me away. That game has probably my favorite intro sequence of any game I could think of. But then on the complete other, almost as like oppositely as you could ever imagine, I would say Spelunky has been like one of the other just like dominating games. I mean, that is like total opposite. The story in that game is almost nothing. I mean, it doesn't really matter at all. That game is all mechanics. It's all mechanics intersecting with each other and like unfolding in surprising ways and letting the player really dig deep down into all of its systems and mechanics to sort of be very expressive through those mechanics and then have all of these just incredible results that happens. You know, something will bounce off something else and come back and totally subvert what you're trying to do in a way that's frustrating but also totally delightful. And I think Spelunky is just an incredible achievement. And then I will say one more, which is kind of in between those two things, which is Far Cry 2, which was a 2008 sequel to the original Far Cry by Ubisoft, Far Cry 2 by Ubisoft Montreal, designed by this guy Clint Hawking, who I have a huge amount of respect for as a game designer. And that's a really interesting game, in part because I think it's a rare example of a first-person shooter that has a really clear goal narratively, and it expresses that goal through its really uncompromising mechanics. That's a game that really disempowers the player. It really makes the player struggle in the face of very difficult circumstances, and I think actually sticks with that intention and that kind of overall vibe in a way that is very uncommon and very admirable. It's a game that can be very frustrating to play, but when you understand it and when you stick with it and when you really dig into it, I think it's incredibly rewarding and a really rare example of a game that is very deep mechanically, but is using that mechanical depth for a really coherent kind of tonal purpose.
Can you explain that part a bit more? So on Far Cry 2, mm-hmm. So you're talking about the open mechanics, so it's making it difficult, or like what was like the hard part, and what makes it stand out?
It's difficult in you die very easily in that game. You have malaria, which you have to constantly treat with medication, or you'll collapse. Your guns take damage over time, and then will rust and misfire or fail. So you have to get new ones. It's just it's very challenging to just stay alive in that game. But the thing that is cool is that all of the systems collide in really surprising ways. So things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So let's say you going into a kind of enemy camp and you throw a grenade and you're like, okay, great, perfect. I'm going to throw this grenade and it's going to blow up these guys in the house. But maybe as you do that, a car drives by and the grenade bounces off the car and then blows up a gas canister, and then the grass lights on fire and the fire spreads to where you are, and you're like, oh my God, what is this? I did not expect this to happen. And then you start running, and you are in trouble now because now you've been exposed and the enemies are shooting at you. But then that same fire lights some different set of things on fire, which then destroys the enemies you were trying to destroy in the first place. And then you steal that truck that drove by and, end up hitting a deer or something and go off.
Something.
It's just one of those games where there are so many different systems that all talk to each other, that all sort of work together, both in your favor, but also against you, because they're just part of the world. It's just, the whole thing is constructed in a really, really kind of holistically interactive way. And your plans never go as you expect them to, but often they will fail in ways that you can actually still pull out of. Or even if you don't pull out of it, the failure was so outrageous and fascinating that it ends up being kind of interesting. I mean, it's a game that you have to go into it not expecting it to be like Doom or something where you're just going to have total mastery over the environment. Like you won't. You'll die a lot and it'll be frustrating. But if you can appreciate the sort of the way that everything kind of ties together and learn how it all works, it can be just incredibly satisfying. Because when you do succeed, it feels like you really accomplished something because you're succeeding, despite all of these things that are inevitably going to go wrong.
Man, I wish I started with part 2 now, because I started part 3, Far Cry 3. And I know
it's a very different game. It was by a different team. It's a very different game. Far Cry 1, 2, and 3 are interesting because they're all basically completely different from each other. They're all essentially totally different games. The only thing they really have in common is that they all take place in these kind of beautiful, large environments.
Wow. Okay. Why do you love being part of the video game industry?
I think probably for me, the biggest reason is that I've gotten to learn so many different skills that I never would have imagined doing. I mean, like I said, I was a music major in college, so I certainly never had any idea that I would end up becoming someone who was a professional designer or writer or developer or any of these things. And it's making video games is so big and complicated that there's always something new to learn. I mean, there's always new things to learn. And I really, really enjoy that. Yeah,
especially with the technology just advancing so fast. Yeah, it's going to be a lot to it.
It's incredible. I mean, when I look at the things that younger developers are now making just completely on their own, like individually, it's absurd. I mean, it's totally amazing what can be done now with cheap or even free tools that allow so many different people to make games. Or if you're already a game developer, it just expands what you can do even more. I mean, it's incredible. Like we use Unity at Campo Santo, and I cannot believe how usable Unity is compared to other tool sets I've used in the past. It's just incredible what's out there now.
Yep, a great time to make a game does. So yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Before we go into the lightning round, don't forget on my website, you can check out GameDevLoadout.com for all these show notes. I'm going to list everything that we just talked about today. Type in the number 92 in the search bar to find Chris' episode. And now, Chris, are you ready to crush the lightning round?
Sure. Let's do it.
What was holding you back from joining the game industry?
Oh, I just never even thought about it. I got involved in it in such a weird way. It wasn't something I grew up thinking about. I totally ended up in it through sideways means.
What's a personal habit that contributes to your success?
I think wanting to always learn new things.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Best piece of advice I ever received. Probably be humble.
Be humble. I like that. What's a great marketing tip to make yourself and your game stand out?
be willing to learn and be excited about what you're doing. And I think other people will be able to identify that too.
What resources should we use today?
Oh, wow. Searching Google. Like I said, I'm not a trained programmer, and whenever I need to figure something out, I just search for it. And the great thing about games is that unlike some professional fields, there's so many people doing it publicly that you can almost always find what you're looking for.
Just ask online. All right. So this next question is pretty big. Imagine you woke up the next morning in a brand new world and you knew no one. You still have all the experience and knowledge you currently have today. Your food and shelter is taken care of and you have a laptop. What would you do step by step on the path to join and become successful in the game industry?
Oh, wow. That's tough. Wow, that's really interesting. If I actually had all the skills I had now, I would probably I would probably actually make something very different than what I'm making now. I would make something that I would be more capable of individually making without being part of a larger team. So I would probably actually start trying to make something that's more of a systems driven, less narratively focused game. I would probably try to make something small scale that's closer to a Spelunky or something like that. Not that I could ever actually make Spelunky, because I think Spelunky is like one of the most incredible achievements in video game design of all time. But I would probably start making something more on that scale, because I have always wanted to make something like that, and I think it would be more achievable for at a much smaller scale.
Oh, wait, why can't you do something like that currently?
Oh, just because I'm way too busy.
Oh, okay. In the future.
Yeah. No, in the future, I would love to make something like that for sure.
Awesome. We have reached the end. Go ahead and give us one last parting piece of guidance and how we can connect with you, and then we'll say goodbye.
If you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter at Chris Remo, ChrisRemo, and links to everything else is on there. Our company is camposanto.com, and you can check out our next game in the Valley of Gods.
And what's one last parting piece of guidance?
Guidance? Oh, I would say be interested in as many things as you can, not just games, but anything else. Read books, watch movies, read articles, learn about new things. I think that has been hugely helpful to me, and I always love working with people who have a wide set of interests.
And of course, check out his podcast as well, guys. I'm going to link everything up. Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. For that, we are truly grateful, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Game Devs, for listening. I hope we brought you value today. Equip yourself with the best loadout and take action. Subscribe to the podcast to get the latest episodes. And if you think the episode was helpful and want to support me, I greatly appreciate it if you share it with your colleagues. It would be a big help to me. Until then, I'm your host, Tony Chan, and I'll catch you next Wednesday on the Game Dev Loadout podcast. Peace.